Well, hello and welcome back to In the Word. Continuing with our Thursday Bible study in the book of Revelation. We are up to chapter 20 at this point, so we're really making good progress. Be finishing up here in the next couple of weeks and on to something else. If you have some ideas on what you'd like to look at, let me know. I have some thoughts in mind that I'll be sharing with you later. But I am interested in how best to serve you. So if there's a particular book that you like to explore, excuse me, I got a little cough. If there's a particular book you'd like to explore, I'd love to hear from you. Chapter 20, as we get to the end of the book of Revelation, we see God's kingdom comes to earth. We see here some startling things, and I'll be pointing those out to you as we go through. So grab your Bible, get to Revelation chapter 20, and follow along with me as we go through here. Just to orient you to where we're at in the book and remind you, we've been in this section, the things which are to come. We've taken our outline from the book itself, and in verse 20, the tribulation has come to an end. In chapter 19, Jesus has returned to the earth. So in contrast with the rapture, where the church goes to meet the Lord in the air, here Jesus actually returns to the earth. So the scene shifts to him being on earth at this point. And then we enter into this period of the millennial kingdom. Let me make a little adjustment here if I can. Maybe not. Let me switch this. Maybe I'll have less glare on my glasses if I do that. So that's where we're at in the context of the whole book, talking about Israel. This is, again, a prophetic perspective, and we are looking at what's happening on earth during this period of time. In light of what we're seeing here, chapters 20 through 22 in that middle part there, we are in this kingdom portion here. And the thing to point out is that the kingdom has been anticipated all through the Old Testament. This is basically the culmination of the Jewish longing through the Old Testament, and the longing as well for us in the church, for Jesus to come and reign and rule from David's throne on the earth. So it's talked about quite a bit in the Old Testament and alluded to in the New Testament. But I did want to point that out because sometimes people will say that the only place that the millennial kingdom is discussed is in this chapter, but that's just not the case. And I'll be talking about Psalm 72 as we talk about what the kingdom is going to be like. And it might be good for you to just jot that down, Psalm 72, and go back and read it later. So, and we'll see by reading that psalm that the kingdom is kind of an intermediate kingdom. It's not perfect, but it's way better than what we experience today. Not as great, not as perfect as it's going to be in the eternal state when we have a new heavens and a new earth. So talk about that when we get to it. Here's our outline for the chapter. You know, it helps me. I hopefully it'll help you as well to think through the chapter if you look at it in the outline form here that I have. So we'll be talking about Satan being imprisoned at the beginning of the millennial kingdom, the reign of the saints, surprisingly, and we'll discuss this, the sinners on earth during the millennial kingdom. Can you imagine that? There's going to be sinners on earth. They're going to besiege the kingdom. We see the satanic trinity then judged and cast into the lake of fire, which I understand to be hell. And then this judgment of God on the earth here. So that's the sections we'll be looking at. So let's jump into verses 1 through 3. It says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand, and he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years." So Again, we encounter angels throughout the book of Revelation. This is 74 times we see angels referenced, and we see another angel referenced here. Could very well be Michael the archangel. We're not told who he is, but he leads a war in heaven against Satan. And reasonable to think that, speculate anyway, that this is Michael the archangel. He Angels throughout the book are agents of God. They're not acting independently. They are agents of God, sent for specific tasks, and this angel takes control of the dragon. Really, what's in view here are physical constraints themselves. So interesting context here that this great chain, we're talking about physical constraints on Satan. Even though he's a spiritual being, he's got this physicality to him, so that when he is bound in hell or bound in chains, that he is physically and spiritually limited on what he can do. So we see that here. Then we see the first of 6 references to the 1,000 years. He's bound for 1,000 years. For the duration of the millennium, Satan is bound. It's specified, and we see this over and over again in verses that I have listed here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Over and over and over again, specifying the duration. Again, some would say that the only place that the duration of the millennial kingdom is identified is here. And it's true. God, in his progressive revelation, has concealed the duration of the kingdom and the fact that it's an intermediate, not a permanent kingdom, until the end of the Bible. Shouldn't surprise us if we're familiar with God's progressive revelation that he would bring the final details out at this point. Also point out that this discussion about the millennial kingdom is really something that's discussed a lot. We've spoken before about the amillennial, the postmillennial, and the premillennial, which we hold to, premillennial view. And it's all around understanding what this millennium is. Now, our postmillennial and amillennial friends, and I'll get into some specifics here in a minute, but they would say that the millennium is just symbolic and it stands for a long period of time that we are currently experiencing, that we are in. We as premillennialists would read this chapter and understand that Jesus doesn't return until the beginning of the millennium. So he doesn't return to the end of chapter 19. Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 12, tells us that there's about a 75-day gap between Jesus's return and the beginning of the kingdom. And then we see the start of the 1,000-year kingdom here. That's the way we take it. Very literal, straightforward. So we're sticking to a literal interpretation of the Bible. Verse 3 says, he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short period of time. So again, what he's experiencing here is complete control. Satan is being completely controlled by this angel who has bound him and threw him. The idea here is forcefully thrown him into the abyss, which is mentioned several times in the book of Revelation. It's not the lake of fire. It's not hell at this point, but it's this temporary abode of the angels where he is confined during the period of Jesus's reign. And he's constrained from specifically what's pointed out here is deceiving the nations. So Satan is known, and Jesus identifies him as a liar and the father of lies. Continues to lie even during this period of time, the church age, and we see that in Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. We see that earlier in Revelation 3:9, where the church is being deceived. He deceives the world. He deceives earth dwellers specifically, and he deceives the nations. So we see throughout this period of time that Satan has been a deceiver. So he can't be bound now, as again, our amillennialist and postmillennialist friends would say. He's on the loose right now, but he will be bound in the future. And then survivors of the tribulation, and I think Old Testament saints are resurrected at this point as well. Survivors of the tribulation enter the kingdom and bear children in the kingdom. And for a time, for this 1,000 years, the children of the people who entered the millennial kingdom are protected from Satan's deception. So we'll see something startling that's going to happen at the end of the millennium, but keep in mind that during this period of time, the offspring of those who physically enter into the kingdom, who survive the tribulation, are going to be protected from Satan's deception. I want to point out that word there, must be. In our reading of the Bible, sometimes we skip over, just read through, I'd say, maybe not skip over is the right thing, but read through certain phrases and don't reflect on what they really mean. Must be, as I've pointed out before, I believe, speaks to divine necessity. It must happen. God has ordained it to happen. I love Robert Thomas's comment here. Robert Thomas, by the way, has a 2-volume commentary on the book of Revelation. It's a little bit technical, but if you are up to it and want to dig into the details of this book, I recommend his 2-volume commentary on the book of Revelation really highly. He says, through this release, the whole universe will see that after 1,000 years of his imprisonment, in an ideal reign on earth, Satan is incurably wicked, and men's hearts are still perverse enough to allow him to gather an army of such an immense size. We'll see this army in a few verses here, but Satan is not reformed by his time in prison. He is not changed. He as soon as he get out, he is at it again. I mentioned the post-millennial view. A prominent proponent of that view is Doug Wilson. You can find him on the internet pretty easily. He's got a blog. He's also got a YouTube channel, publishing house. So post-millennialism is on the rise right now. And he believes that we are in the millennium right now. He believes that we are in a long period, not a literal period of 1,000 years, but a long period in which the church is on the rise. That's the way he looks at it. So when he sees, he thinks, by the way, Satan is bound now during this period of time so that the gospel can be preached to the nations, is his view. And he says in his book called When the Man Comes Around, it's his commentary on the book of Revelation, he says, I do not take this as the vaporization of Satan. I don't know where he gets that vaporization word, but rather as a radical restriction of Satan. So in Doug Wilson's view, Satan is not bound and sealed in the abyss, but he is radically restricted. That's a symbol. This is symbolic of radical restriction. I'd invite you to contrast his view with 2 Corinthians 4:4, where Paul, speaking during this same church age that we are living in, says that the Satan is the king, the ruler of this world, who has blinded eyes to the beauty of Christ. And in Galatians 1:4, Paul calls the present age a time of evil. So it seems to contradict what Doug Wilson is saying here, that Satan is somehow bound. Rather, Paul would say that Satan is ruling right now. So keep that in mind next time you come across some post-millennial discussion or somebody confronts you about what chapter 20 says from a post-millennial view. So let's go on. Verse 4 through 6 in this next section. Let me just make a note of this, if you don't mind. I'm going to take a moment here. Well, I think I'll do this later. Won't interrupt our walk through this chapter. So in verses 4 through 6, we see the reign of the saints. So the thrones in heaven are of God, or the 24 elders. So those are the thrones that we saw in heaven in chapters 2 and 3 when we were going through that. Throne on earth is of Satan. So we see this pretty consistently in the book of Revelation, that the thrones in heaven and we have thrones on earth until Revelation 19:15. And then we have a change here, which we're talking about. In Revelation 5:10, as we look back, we're reminded that we have this promise that the saints will rule. And then the 12 apostles, we are told, we're going to be on thrones. Jesus told us that, Matthew 19:28. Jesus himself is going to occupy the throne of David. And then we also know from Ezekiel that David himself would be on a throne. Let me just comment on that Ezekiel reference there. Some would understand this to be that the reference to David being on a throne is actually anticipating David's greater son, Jesus, being on a throne. I take the view, however, that when it says David will be on a throne, it means David will also reign. So we'll have David, the 12 tribes, Jesus, the saints, and then we have the 24 elders in heaven. So we have thrones set up and they sat on them. I think this is all the people who are referencing, and judgment was given to them. I think this is the saints being empowered to rule and reign with Jesus over the earth during this time. The end of verse 4, I saw the thrones. I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So we look at these ones who were beheaded. This is particularly a Roman sort of civil sentence for citizens of Rome. So crucifixion was too brutal for them. Other forms of execution were used for non-Romans, but for Romans it was quick and clean beheading. When we look through the Bible, we see reasons for beheading. For example, speaking God's word, or rejecting idolatry, or rejecting the mark of the beast. These are all reasons that were given for beheading in the Bible. And these who had suffered, these who had died, these who had been put to death, come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. So they are resurrected. That's what we see here. They are resurrected and they reign with Christ. So what exactly does that mean? What does exactly say in Revelation 5:10 that the saints will reign with him? I'm not exactly sure. We'll have responsibility. We'll have responsibility with regard to, in proportion to our faithfulness. But exactly what that'll look like, we're just not given details about that. But we are told that they will come to life. So this is, I think, clearly a literal and physical resurrection. So when we ask this question, who was reigning with Christ during the millennial kingdom? We see David and the 12 apostles. We see the resurrected Old Testament saints. We see the overcomers of the church age. These are the ones that enter into the millennial kingdom in their physical bodies. And then we see the tribulation martyrs who are also resurrected and come into the kingdom with their resurrection bodies, their eternal bodies. What will the millennium be like? It's a good question. What is it going to be like to be living in that kingdom with Jesus? Again, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details on what's going to happen there. It will be on earth, right? So this vision that John is seeing in Revelation 20 is a vision of what's happening on earth, and Jesus will reign on earth from Jerusalem. So it will be here. We won't be floating around up in heaven, disembodied. We will be here physically on earth. I think Psalm 72 gives us some insight into what that might be like. If you want to know more, I've got a link down in the notes for this episode that'll take you over to a playlist where I have 3 videos that talk about the nature of this millennial kingdom and contrast it with the amillennial view, which is very similar to the postmillennial view. So if you want to dig deeper, you can go look at that playlist, which I'll linked for you below. But Psalm 72, again, gives us insight. Now, the psalm was originally a psalm to Solomon, from David to Solomon. So Solomon is the immediate reference. But as you read through the Psalms, you'll see that there's an ultimate fulfillment of a worldwide rule over all the nations that can only be fulfilled in the coming kingdom, in the millennium, in the reign of the Messiah. So there's an ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, which is why it gives us some insight into what that millennial kingdom will be like. What we find there, it's an intermediate kingdom. So surprisingly, for some perhaps, was for me when I first looked into this, is that there's going to still be those who are distressed. Oppression is going to continue. And as you look through that psalm, make note of verses 2 and 4 and 12, where we see the distressed continue, the poor continue, oppression and oppressors continue to exist. But at the same time, side by side, there is rule, right? There is the application of Jesus's perfect law. I think we get a hint of that in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. The Sermon on the Mount gives us a picture of what that law looks like. But Jesus will be administering that law, and it will be swift. It will be quick. We see it again in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, where the nations are streaming to Jerusalem for the judgments of the king. So this is going to be going on. There's going to be active judgment over the earth. It's going to be swift. It's going to be quick. It's going to be from Jesus, I think, through everyone who is reigning and ruling with him. So in other words, the millennial kingdom is going to be a lot better than what we see today. We're not going to see people getting away with evil. We're going to see them brought to account quickly and justly. But it's not yet as good as it's going to be in the eternal state, which we'll see in chapters 21 and 22. So I think that sums it up. If you want to know more, I'd say take a look at that playlist that I've linked at the bottom. So verses 5 through 6, the rest of the dead. Now notice what he's doing here. He's making a distinction between the resurrection of the Old Testament saints, the resurrection of the tribulation martyrs, and the rest of the dead, who did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. So there's obviously at least 2 resurrections. one of the righteous and one of the unrighteous, separated by 1,000 years. This first resurrection, the one where the righteous are raised, this is the first resurrection, it says. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power. We'll see the second death before the end of this chapter. But they, that is, those ones that participated in the first resurrection, will be priests of God and Christ and will reign with him, hear it again, for 1,000 years will reign. There's going to be some ruling that the resurrected saints are going to participate in during the millennial kingdom. As I pointed out earlier, this is a consistent promise. So there is a first resurrection of the righteous, a second resurrection 1,000 years later of the unsaved, and at that point Satan is bound and the power of death is overcome. So we'll see that here. Again, if we contrast this with the postmillennial view. Now, postmillennialism and amillennialism itself as well would teach that we are in the 1,000 years now, that the 1,000 years is not literal, that it's figurative, and we are in it now. So I'll let Doug Wilson speak for himself. He says there is no need to take the reference to this millennium, this 1,000 years, as a literal one. This is a symbolic number, a symbolic chapter in a highly symbolic book. Well, I'd take exception with Doug Wilson here. I think there is a need to take it literally. It's mentioned 6 times in these first verses, over and over, emphasizing the number. In the book of Revelation, we see the numbers are literal throughout the book of Revelation. When he talks about a large number or an uncountable number, he tells us that. When he tells us about a specific number, 24 elders, 4 living beasts, he is very specific. John is very specific on that, and he's being specific here. A literal, grammatic, historic, hermeneutic, that is, taking the Bible seriously, taking it for what it says, does make it necessary to understand this, not as symbolism, but as a literal revelation that this kingdom is going to last for 1,000 years. So when we look at this and we take it literally and we understand it literally, we see Jesus who is resurrected. We see at least 4 resurrections in the Bible. We see a resurrection of Jesus. We see a resurrection of church age believers, and that's going to happen at the end of the church age and at the rapture. We see the Old Testament and tribulation saints resurrected according to the promises that were given them by the prophets. And that happens at the millennial kingdom. They will enter the millennial kingdom of the Messiah, which they have been promised and which they have been hoping for. And then finally, in Revelation 20, verses 11 and following, we'll see the unsaved from all ages are raised at the end of the millennial kingdom. So we see at least 4 resurrections in the Bible. I'd even include the resurrection of Lazarus here. We could say 5. I don't have the resurrection of the son of the widow of Nain, so we could say 6. But there are multiple resurrections throughout the Bible, and no reason to deny that. Let's go on here. Doug Wilson, however, denies that the righteous are raised separately from a general resurrection at the end of history, despite what I think to be very clear revelation here in Revelation chapter 20. He says, so every believer who is truly converted throughout all church history is made partaker of the resurrection of Jesus, the first resurrection. So what Doug Wilson is doing here is he is saying, let me just take it apart. Every believer truly converted throughout all church history. So, from Doug Wilson's perspective, the church began in the Old Testament, that Israel represented the church of the Old Testament. So he's saying that the Old Testament believers and the New Testament believers will all be partakers of one resurrection. And that resurrection is the resurrection of Jesus. That is, we are raised with him, as it says in Romans 6. We are put to death with him and raised with him, Old Testament and New Testament believers alike. So he is looking at what it says here in the book of Revelation, and he's denying what it clearly says, that there'll be multiple resurrections. And again, my point here is that if you just take this at face value, take the words that John has written at face value, and cross-reference them appropriately in the rest of the Bible, I think it's very clear that there's multiple resurrections foretold and promised, and those promises will be kept. So again, if you're confronted by a post-millennial or an amillennial view, or told that there's only one general resurrection, I think that Revelation chapter 20, verse 4 is a solid foundation for the belief, the conviction that there's multiple resurrections coming. So surprisingly, in verses 7 through 9, we see a attack at the end of the 1,000 years. Again, the 1,000 years are mentioned here clearly. Let me back up a little bit. It says, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. So again, Satan is clearly bound here for a particular period of time, and then he's released. And when he's released, he goes back to his own ways. He goes back to deceiving the nations. And then he says, which are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. So let's take a look at that, Gog and Magog. Some say, okay, the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39 happens here. This reference to Gog and Magog, they would say, is definitive that this happens here. But I believe if you step back and look at this clearly and systematically, you'll see that there's a great difference between the war that's talked about, or wars, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and the war that's referenced here. For example, in Ezekiel, the northern nations gather against Israel. Here, all the nations are coming. In Ezekiel, the invasion is a prelude to the millennium, which is talked about in the subsequent chapters in Ezekiel. So we see this progression in Ezekiel from the regathering of Israel in the land to the attack, the tribulation, and then the millennium. Here in Revelation 20, the invasion, the war, concludes the millennium. It comes at the end of the 1,000 years, and it precedes the eternal state. So it seems to be out of sync with what's talked about in Ezekiel, and so out of sync that Ezekiel seems to be a separate war. At the end of the war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the dead are cleared out over a 7-month period. But here in Revelation 9, it said the fire came down from heaven and devoured the attackers. It seems like they were instantly incinerated, instantly devoured. So there's not this 7-month period talked about here. There is in Ezekiel. And also, Satan is at work during Ezekiel 38 and 39. He is at work opposing the work of God. Here, Satan is bound before the invasion. He is restricted in the abyss. He is not deceiving the nations before this happens. It's only after it happens that the nations are summoned and rallied and fooled and deceived into attacking Jerusalem. Again, I think this is a convincing argument. Wish I could take credit for it. It's not my argument. It's an argument of Dr. Pentecost. And I've mentioned his book before, Things to Come. Really a thick book. It looks a little intimidating, but I encourage you to get it. It's an easy read. It's a good read, well written. Also, Mark Hitchcock's book, The End, I think is a kind of an updated version of Things to Come, and brings more insight and understanding and equally good reading, equally well organized, so it makes it an easy read. And I'd encourage you to get that book as well. So, Things to Come in the End, great books. Back to this section then. It says they came up, that this is the attackers on Jerusalem. They came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. This is a short war. The area around Jerusalem, the broad plain of the earth, is surrounded. It's fully occupied. So it looks as if Satan has really gathered together a large force. Where are they coming from? They're coming from the offspring of the tribulation saints who survived that tribulation. They come into the millennial kingdom physically. They have been preserved physically. They are going to have children. Their children will have children. Their children's children will have children, and down through it'll go. And they will come into the kingdom as people in the flesh will need to exercise faith in the Messiah, and some will not, surprisingly enough. And this is where the attackers are coming from. And they are attacking Jerusalem and the camp of the faithful here. They came up and surrounded the camp of the saints. Some would see this as two different places. I see them as synonymous, that Jerusalem is the camp of the saints. The term that's translated camp there, peribole, is a technical term. It's a technical military term for a fortified camp. So there's been some period of time where this force has been gathering, and the saints are responding by fortifying the city and preparing for what's coming. Good aside here, maybe a good application for us sometimes, is that this has to happen. This has been ordained. Nevertheless, the saints prepare. And when we are confronted with God's word and we see the decrees that he has mandated, doesn't mean that it frees us from preparation. Confidence and security does not equal complacency. So these saints take action when they see something happening here. And what happens is that these rebellious ones suffer the fate of Sodom. They suffer the fate of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. They suffer the fate of the soldiers that were sent to arrest Ezekiel 3 times. 2 of those times, the soldiers were incinerated. They are going to suffer Gog, the judgment of Gog and Magog. And I think that's why they're called Gog and Magog in verse 8, because they are like those nations. They are going through the same rebellion that those nations have exercised, and they're going to suffer the same fate. So Gog and Magog are the type, and what happens here is the antitype. Sodom and Gomorrah is the type. We see here it fulfilled in the antitype. So we see how this works in the Bible. Going on here, then, we see this verse 10, the fate of the satanic trinity. So once this final rebellion is put down, and the attackers are incinerated, we see the beginning of the judgment. The devil who is deceived by them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. And verse 11 says, "And I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, and those whose presence earth and from whose presence earth and heaven fled, and nowhere was found in them." So I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but let me just address this question about whether the earth and the heavens as they exist today are going to be renewed, or are they going to be replaced? And I'm going to defer to Dr. Walvard here. I deferred to Dr. Pentecost earlier. I'm deferring to Dr. Walvard. I agree with him. That's why he says that what they are today, the earth and the starry heavens as they are today, will be destroyed at this point, and simply destroyed at this point in the future, and will be simply restored to a new state of purity. That's the question. Is that what's going to happen? He says many references in the Bible suggest that the earth and the heavens as we now know them will be destroyed. This is confirmed by the opening statement of verse 21. We'll get there in Revelation later. The heavens and the earth, the first earth, passed away. So it seems like this is the time when the new heavens and the new earth are going to come. The old heavens and the old earth will be cast away. They were going to be fled. They're going to be destroyed. And we see in verse 13 the judgment that's coming. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to their deeds. Let me focus on that, according to their deeds. God's judgment is never arbitrary. God's judgment is according to goodness and righteousness, and the judgment is according to their deeds. They are judged for what they've done. Ultimately, they are judged for rejecting Christ, and they do that freely. Calvinism, sometimes people look at Calvinism and they'll dismiss it, saying that Calvinism takes away free will. And if you take away free will, then God is an unrighteous judge who judges people for doing things that he's decreed them to do, that they can't help it. Well, that's not quite what Calvinism says. Calvinism doesn't deny free will. Calvinism affirms free will, but in affirming it, it says that the free will of sinful man is limited to only choose what is evil. So, for example, if I am on a diet and my flesh is rebelling against that diet, and I go to the refrigerator, and all of I find is in the refrigerator is a pint of Ben & Jerry's chunky chocolate and another pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I have to choose one or the other. I'm just choosing one of two evils. I'm just choosing one of two evils. That's the sinner. The sinner's will is bound by their sinfulness, bound by the sin of Adam. That's what happens here. They do evil, and they're judged according to the evil that they do. So that brings us to the end of the book, brings us to the end of the chapter 21. We'll pick up next time in chapter 21 with the new heavens and the new earth and the beginning of the eternal state. But brothers and sisters, as I close out, let me encourage you to be looking forward to this. Join with the Old Testament saints and look forward to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Look, of course, to the rapture of the church, but look forward even more than the rapture to the reign and rule of Christ on earth, that we will be ruling with him. We will be here on an earth that's being transformed, that's being brought under the rule and reign of Christ, and rejoice that we will participate in this. And, it kind of gives me goosebumps to think about it. Rejoice that even now your names are known in heaven. And this is Jesus's plan for you. So, let me go back here. God bless you. Hope you're finding this useful, finding this encouraging, educating, and that you are growing in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. God bless you, brothers and sisters. See you next time.